The city of Spokane, a jewel of the inland Northwest. Landmarks spark images of home here in the Lilac City, from the clock tower to the pavilion and the mighty rush of the blue and white capped Spokane River through the heart of downtown. You can talk about the forests or the lakes or the bridges or the headlines almost daily. Best cities to retire, best places to raise a family, best. There's a lot to like. We're pretty spoiled. But nothing's perfect. And a groundswell of numerous forces have shifted the tone on the streets. What those forces are depends on who you ask and how they view one of the critical, if not the number one issue our city faces right now: homelessness. There is compassion, frustration, uncertainty, fear, with as many questions as ideas on how to solve it.
Closing in on 1 month since Camp Hope, the state's largest homeless encampment.
Camp Hope disbanded in June, but for 18 months it existed, thrived, some would say, swelling to the size of a small town on the city's eastern edge.
I would never want to create another Camp Hope.
Camp Hope drawing controversy like a divining rod and dividing so many for so long. But homelessness in Spokane is not new. Some history. Spokane Chronicle documented it over the decades. In 1958, it had become enough of an issue, the House of Charity opened to help. In fact, in 1912, Catholic Diocese began working on a plan to address homelessness. Spokane had only been a city for 30 years at that point and had to start nearly from scratch again in the 1890s after the Great Fire. Homelessness and all the tentacles of it, winding through our city history, like the Spokane River ribbons through our city. We know homelessness isn't the disease itself. It's a symptom of a much deeper, much more complex, heartbreaking problem. The underlying cause? A fractured job market, a housing crunch, the twin crises of mental health and addiction, a complicated and interwoven series of issues that can't be solved overnight. It'll take leadership, bold innovation, empathy. It'll take all of us. It'll have to start at the top. So who will you choose to lead us? Tonight is your chance to learn more, to guide your vote. Welcome to the 2023 Mayoral Forum on Homelessness in Spokane. And a good evening, everyone. I'm Sean Owsley. Welcome to this special edition, Nonstop Local 630, a live debate in the Spokane mayoral race. For the 5 candidates you'll see on the ballot, here with us in person tonight, the 5th, Patrick McCann, had a conflict, could not be here. We look forward to discussion. And we are focusing tonight on one sole issue, the homeless crisis and its effect on our city of Spokane. We're live from the downtown library. Here is a background on the candidates that we'll be debating tonight. Tim Archer. He spent 2 decades as a firefighter and had leadership roles as an officer in the Army and the Spokane Firefighters Union. He's Spokane born and raised. His focus, public safety, homelessness, and housing. Lisa Brown moved to Spokane in 1980 to teach economics at Eastern Washington University. She also worked at Gonzaga and Washington State, and she moved into politics. Spent 20 years as a legislator and was most recently the director of Washington's Department of Commerce. Her focus, the economy, home ownership, homelessness. Kelly Stevens has lived most of her life in Spokane. She works for the City of Spokane Streets Department. When she's not filling potholes, Stevens is thinking about how to make her city a better place to live and work. Stevens' focus, gang violence, property crime, and homelessness. Mayor Nadine Woodward worked as an anchor in local TV news for nearly 3 decades, first in Idaho, then in Spokane. Mayor Woodward's first run for political office was in 2019 when she ran for and won the Spokane mayoral race. Woodward's focus, public safety, affordable housing, and homelessness. That is the background. It is time to talk about a homeless crisis here in the city of Spokane. Just a quick lay of the land as far as the rules agreed to. Each candidate will get 2 minutes for an opening statement, 1 minute for a closing statement. The questions will be posed. Each candidate will be able to answer that. 90 seconds for that response. There is a 45-second rebuttal option. We'll use that discreetly because of a time crunch. So we do begin, and we have selected an order for the opening statements. We begin on the far left with Mr. Archer. For an opening statement, each has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Sean. My name is Tim Archer. I served you as a firefighter and an EMT for 20 years. I was on your streets and in your homes during what was, for some, their worst moments. You can ask, how can a firefighter lead your city? I'll tell you how. I was also an Army officer. I've been a commander, an executive officer, an operations officer, and a logistics officer in several organizations, in several environments. One of my opponents has been siloed in administrative government and politics, coming up with million-dollar solutions to $1,000 problems. Another one of my opponents was reporting about emergencies while I was elbows deep in the emergency, mitigating it. What Spokane needs is strong leadership, because we do not have a homeless problem. We have a government problem. What I'm out to do is to make Spokane the most miserable city in the state for criminals, while making it the most welcoming city in the state for families, for law-abiding citizens, and visitors. Thank you, Sean.
Ms. Brown.
Lisa Brown. Despite what you might see on the negative ads, we aren't as far apart as you think. People in Spokane want a homeless response system that is compassionate and effective. In the 2019 KHQ homelessness debate, candidate Woodward said that under her leadership, Spokane could be a model for other cities. I don't need to tell you 4 years later that we are not. Homelessness has doubled to nearly 2,600 people. Instead of a plan, there's been a parade of housing directors and city administrators. The Cannon Street shelter, owned by the city, was closed, then opened. Now it's closed again. We've leased a warehouse on Trent, owned by a political donor, without windows, running water, or bathrooms, and poured money into it, $13 million this year. Homeless people are shuffled from the street to shelter, emergency rooms, or jail, and then they're back on the street again. What this administration is doing isn't working for the homeless, for businesses, neighborhoods, or taxpayers. Fortunately, there is a better way. My homelessness plan has 4 parts to it: a navigation center model that coordinates resources, identifies homeless people by name, assesses their needs, holds the individual and the system accountable for results. Street medicine teams, using people trained to treat and de-escalate people having crises on the street. Freeing up more capacity for our law enforcement officers, who are currently only responding to 42% of calls. Increasing housing supply, using millions of dollars of state and federal dollars this mayor has left on the table or poorly managed. And preventing homelessness, using local nonprofits to assist people before they become homeless. With new leadership in the mayor's office, with collaboration and coordination instead of blaming and litigating, Spokane, we can turn this around.
Ms. Stevens.
Thanks, Sean. Good evening. I'm the pothole fixer. You might not recognize me because my clothes are clean. But first of all, I'd like to change the vocabulary I've been using from housing first to shelter first. Housing is ideal, but in a crisis, shelters win. I know we all want the same thing. We want our streets cleaned up, so it's just we may differ on how we're going to get there. So I want you to remember these 2 stories going forward throughout tonight. Last year in March, I saved the life of a homeless man who had overdosed. I showed compassion to someone who actually created trauma for me in that moment. I didn't want to have to do that. Nobody wants to be in either of those positions. But no matter what, compassion is the key. The other thing I'd like you to remember is I'm a foster parent. I've had to learn and continue to learn how to walk with someone through trauma. I've learned how to build love and a relationship, which doesn't come naturally to a random kid that comes to your house. You have to build those things. And so tonight, my words, some of them may seem harsh, but I'm really about tough love, but love, and that's the important thing. Thank you.
Mayor Woodward.
Thank you, Sean. When I ran for mayor 4 years ago, I did so because I wanted to do great things for the city that I love. And I didn't come from a place of politics. I was a broadcast journalist who people trusted me to deliver the news for 28 years. And they have trusted me to lead our city through incredibly unprecedented times in my first term. A global health pandemic, a summer of protests, our city's first riot, workforce shortages, a housing crisis, and Camp Hope. And any one of those things would have been a huge challenge for anybody in their first term, but we have been able to manage every single crisis that we've experienced and lead our city through that. We're here to talk about one of our city's biggest challenges, and that's homelessness. And I'm proud of my record of bringing people together to deliver results for the city of Spokane. We've added 500 more beds to the regional shelter system. We kept the unsheltered housed during the pandemic. We opened TRACK, a navigation center that every single night offers more than 300 people a bed and access to wraparound programs like mental health and drug treatment. I'm really excited about the work that continues. We started last fall on creating a regional homeless authority to better coordinate the resources and funding that we have regionally and to have better outcomes from that. I work with our police chief to fight reckless state policy that decriminalized drugs for the last 2 years. We are now leading the nation in overdoses, nearly 3,000. Just last year. I got 27 other mayors from across the country to send a loud and clear message to our legislature that we wanted tougher guardrails to compel people to get the help they need, people who are dying on our street every single day, and increasing our homeless count. Sometimes the job of mayor is to fight the reckless policies of the state and our city government. At the local level, too, with our city council, I'm ready to continue to fight for the city that we all love. There is so much at stake in this election, and it's about the future of our city.
Thanks to all the candidates and for staying on time right out of the gate. The first question, and we have a pre-selected order which I will walk you through as we go through this live debate. The homeless crisis often intersects with other issues like public safety, including crime. How will you balance the needs of the homeless population while also addressing concerns from frustrated residents and business owners and employees? Furthermore, what is your priority? The needs of the homeless weighed against the needs of residents and businesses. Mayor Woodward, you're first.
Well, I think it's both. I think there's a balance, and I think we can address both. Homelessness also intersects with public safety and certainly housing. And what we saw at Camp Hope was a priority of the homeless over neighbors and businesses, and I think that's absolutely wrong. That neighborhood was victimized for 18 months when we had a place for them to go, and that was the navigation center that we call TRACK. It's a difficult one. As I said, fighting the reckless policies of our state that have led us into this situation that we're in right now. The decriminalization of drugs has been the #1 issue in our state. Between February 22 and February 23, nearly 3,000 people died. We have to have more accountability in our programs. And you know what? The criminal justice system has to be a part of that. I've talked to many, many people who are addicted on our street, houseless. And they have said it was because I was arrested for the crimes that I committed that I was compelled to get the help that I needed. That has to be an option. We are a compassionate community, and we have resources. But there are a lot of people who are on our streets that don't want to follow rules, that don't want to get access to the resources that we have, and that's a problem. That's a community conversation. As a community, what are we going to do to people who don't want help, that are committing crimes and victimizing our neighborhoods and our businesses?
Ms. Stevens?
She brought up some great points, but I do feel like our state has taken personal liberties over personal responsibility, and it's led us to a place of no accountability. I would love for us to build enough shelters to require people to be in those shelters, because once they are in those shelters, they are clean, they're in a clean space, they're safe, and the access to those services are right there. And one thing I would say about Camp Hope is the congregation of people allowed for services to go out there and hit them hard with what they had. And if that was the one good thing that we found from Camp Hope, then I'm gonna name it. A lot of people were helped.
Mr. Archer.
Thank you, Sean. My priority is crime. Crime is not a community conversation. Crime is mitigated by law enforcement officers. The chief of police will work directly for me. His job will be to mitigate crime. I don't need to talk to any of you about that. Crime is illegal. Camp Hope, I was told by the former sheriff, could have been mitigated a year ago had he had support from the city administration. This is a government problem, not a homeless problem. Let's stop blaming the homeless for what we are not doing.
Mrs. Brown.
Thank you. Public safety cannot be solved without having a coordinated homeless response system. And what I am hearing from neighborhoods is that they have homeless people in neighborhoods as well, and that police response is inadequate when they call. So we have to do both. I will say that accountability for individuals can go hand in hand with offering resources, but we need accountability for the system as well. That's why a navigation center is a good move. A navigation center, which is working in other cities, brings the resources together and it offers people services, identifies them by name, and that creates the accountability for them and for the providers who provide those services. Regarding Camp Hope, it never should have happened, and the math is wrong here. There were way more homeless people in the community than there were places of shelter. A shelter closed, and that was part of the beginning of Camp Hope. And the way to prevent other Camp Hopes from happening is to have a plan, which in 4 years we haven't gotten.
The Trent Shelter, specifically a low-barrier shelter, opened in September of 2022. Holds up to 350 people. It's estimated to cost the city more than $10 million per year to run, has been surrounded by controversy and operational problems since it opened last year. It provides beds, but the ongoing complaint from people on the streets and homeless advocates is the city does not have enough beds for those who need it. That complaint, a lack of beds, led to Camp Hope. Do you support the concept of the Trent Shelter and the current level of funding for it? And how do you deal with the operational issues? First response goes to Mrs. Brown.
Thank you. I do not support the Trent Shelter. I think it's literally a money pit. The actual amount is $13 million a year. And keep in mind that the first operator, the Guardians, are still not accounted for $1 million. And the city was looking into that, but we haven't heard the results of that. Shelters can be part of an effective homeless system, but shelters alone will not do the successful job of transitioning people with services, often mental health or addiction, detox, etc., employment services, and then on to permanent supportive housing. So the shelter itself is also leased. That makes no sense for the city's taxpayers to be putting capital renovations into a leased facility, at the same time having shut down the Cannon Street facility, which the city owns and could be utilizing. So again, to me, this is a pattern of lack of planning, lurching from one solution to another, no long-term vision, and certainly no coordination with partners that were available to help coordinate.
Ms. Stevens.
The Trent Shelter, yes, I do believe it's a money pit, but it is somewhere to go for now. We definitely need to be looking at more options. City-owned properties that we have already, perhaps, would be an option. But yeah, renting a space, it's just like renting an apartment, right? You don't get anything from it later. And we definitely want to reduce the cost in the future. Yeah.
Mayor Woodward.
Well, Lisa, I just want to remind you that we do operate TRAC as a navigation center, and you must have supported it because Commerce gave us $2 million for it in 2023, and you're giving us more money in 2024 and 2025. We don't have the money to buy a shelter. It's about $3.5 million, just to let you know the government doesn't do a very good job of maintaining their own facilities. And it's an expensive model, no doubt. When you operate a navigation center with wraparound services, with mental health and drug addiction, we're going to start a virtual court in there. We feed people 3 meals, more than 300 every single day. Leasing was the best way to go because I don't think we're going to need it after, say, 4 or 5 years. We're going to have less reliance on emergency shelter because we can finally start working on low-income housing and build up our housing stock so we can better take people through the system. And those infrastructure improvements that Lisa was talking about is actually driving the costs down. So we don't have to have portable showers, portable restrooms. We can have actual inside restrooms, all the things that have been criticized about the shelter, but that will bring the costs down below $10,000 or $10 million a year.
Can I respond to that?
Let me have Mr. Archer respond, and then I'll give you 45 for rebuttal since you were called out personally.
Thank you.
Okay, just to respond to the lack of beds, baloney. The Union Gospel Mission operates 180 beds. They've never had to turn away anyone for lack of bed space. They've had to turn away folks because they're not willing to comply with the rules. When you're providing services, you're absolutely entitled to demand accountability for those services. What's happening is we're using words like navigation center, wraparound facilities, regional homeless authority, when you have a model that's decades old that works. What I support are high barrier models like the Union Gospel Mission. The criticism of that is it's faith-based. That's fine. Let's support one that's Muslim, atheist, environmentalist, whatever we need to do. But let's support programs that work, that have worked for decades, rather than trying to invent new ones at the tune of approximately $30 million a year. We're sitting here scratching our heads what to do with your $30 million.
Mrs. Brown, your 45-second rebuttal.
Thanks. People are having a little trouble with the math. 2,600 homeless people does not fit into the Trent shelter or the rest of our shelter system. The Trent shelter is not a navigation center. It is a warehouse being turned into a shelter with some services. Third, Commerce did provide funding for people who moved from Camp Hope to shelter. That included the Trent shelter, $2 million of operating dollars. That included Hope House. That included compassion addiction treatment, detox beds, and the mayor and I had a personal conversation in which I advised against getting a leased facility because that limits the kind of state funding that you can get in order to do the capital improvements.
Mayor Woodward, I'll give you 45 seconds to respond.
Well, again, we didn't have the money to buy a shelter. And so if we could lease it at a lower cost, that was the way that we wanted to go. And it is operating as a navigation center. We bring people in. They are known by name and need. There are case workers on site with the wraparound services that the navigation centers that we visited in Houston when I was there last fall, exactly the way they operate it. It may be larger than we want. I mean, I'll just tell you, I didn't think we were going to have in the summertime more than 300 people every single night. But obviously there's a need for this. That's more than 300 people that would be on the street right now that are getting connected to services and help. So you can call it a mistake, you funded it, people are getting help, and people are off the street.
Some cities have adopted the housing first approach, providing stable housing as a priority before addressing other issues. Spokane has used that model. Last year, HUD provided millions of dollars to Spokane. They funded projects with a housing first approach. What are your thoughts to the housing first approach? Will you pursue that strategy if elected and embrace what is being done in that specific area on this issue? Mayor Woodward, you are first.
I do not support housing first. I think it's been a huge mistake. It's certainly been a big mistake in our city. We have 5 havens within just a couple block radius right off of Division, the main gateway off of I-90 into our city, with 50 units in each one of those buildings. That's 250 people within a couple block radius. You've got House of Charity banked right in the middle of that, a night-by-night shelter with about 100 people. 350 chronic homeless individuals who are right downtown, impacting our businesses. They're not getting help. They're the chronic homeless that get to go to the top of the list for housing when they're not ready for housing. It's not a successful model. People aren't getting help in those facilities. They are dying of overdoses and leaving those facilities. That's the only way vacancy is even created. No one is getting help in those facilities. I absolutely do not support it. If anything, we're working with Catholic Charities right now to move House of Charity out of downtown, because that night-by-night shelter is not helping anybody in the havens. But we have to be much more intentional about finding out why people can't be housed, why aren't they successfully staying in housing, and addressing the issues that are keeping them from being housed before we just take them away and put them in a building.
Ms. Stevens.
I also don't really stand with the housing first model. Shelter first is what I believe. Taxpayers, we are required to help out in some fashion, but the funding that comes from our tax money, that goes to shelters. Speaking with a former drug addict, he's against the housing first. He says people just go into those houses and do drugs. Mm-hmm. And the shelter idea, you work there, you get the accountability going, and then you get to move up into these housing situations. But we shouldn't just be giving housing out to people who aren't working for it.
Ms. Brown.
A significant number of people who are homeless do have mental health and or addiction challenges, but many people who are homeless in our community now became homeless because they got evicted from their apartment, or their house was foreclosed, or they were divorced, or they lost their job. They have economic challenges. So we can't deal with everyone who's homeless in the same fashion. The navigation center model is not what Trent is. It coordinates all the facilities and all the providers, and each person in the system is identified by name, offered services, and they are in fact tracked through what services were they offered. Did they accept them? Did they come back into the system after leaving? And that's not what's happening at TRAC right now. And so we can make a difference. Besides, the model of housing first, I think, has evolved into this navigation center model. Then you move towards temporary housing with services and ultimately to housing.
Mr. Archer?
Housing first is another failed social experiment. I was recovering from a procedure in the hospital a few years back, and the gentleman next to me, his brother was visiting me, and he said, you coming back to stay with me? He goes, well, I'm going to see if I can get a place before I leave. So I heard him in there negotiating with whoever it was at the hospital that coordinates this stuff. It wasn't her first rodeo, so she navigated it pretty well. But again, we're conducting social experiments here, whereas we could look at models like the Union Gospel Mission. Hey, what did it look like when you did that? Well, they destroyed the place. As a first responder, I can count maybe on two hands the number of times I've been in Union Gospel Mission facilities. There were shifts where I went 6 times to a Catholic Charities facilities. I went in those buildings when they were brand new, went in them a few weeks later when they had holes kicked in the wall. And then some of the others have alluded to, it's tough if you've got an addiction problem and then your neighbor over there is using. That's not a recipe to get out of it. Housing first doesn't work. And again, we're looking at where to spend. What are we going to try next to do with your $30 million? That seems to be what we're debating, as opposed to what we need is governance. Cities with strong governments and law enforcement don't have these problems. Boise has less than 1/3 of the homeless we have. I like to go to places like Houston and look at these giant models that spend millions of dollars, but don't worry, they're not millions of dollars. Last year, the city's $26 million, only $3.8 million of it was out of your general fund. It's still millions of tax dollars. Thank you, Sean.
We'll take one more question and answer for all of you watching at home on television, and we will stream for roughly another 30 minutes on nonstoplocal.com. So if you want to continue to listen to the questions and the answers here, the live forum with the 4 candidates here on stage, we will continue to stream that on nonstoplocal.com. Over the past decade, it has become crystal clear a large number of homeless cases are tied, as you all have mentioned, to mental health. and addiction, on top of housing about the size of the town of Roselia. I think everyone agrees it was not a good or safe situation. In fact, Julie Garcia, who helped run Camp Hope, told us, quote, "I would never want to create another Camp Hope." What will you do if elected to ensure that no one ever creates another similar situation that took so long to solve? The first response goes to Mr. Archer.
I would close it. Former Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich told me he could have closed it. It was an illegal assembly. You close it. And then if Bob Ferguson, your state attorney general, tells you you can't, you tell him he's trespassing. You take firm stands on these things. You don't think about it. You don't have community conversations. You tell them to get out of our city and stop ruining it. I have no reason to not believe Ozzie Knezovich that he could have done it.
Mrs. Brown?
So, as we've already said, Camp Hope shouldn't have happened, and there wasn't enough shelter capacity. There literally weren't enough places for people to go. At the same time, Camp Hope won't happen again on state land because the Department of Transportation has committed to continue to monitor those parcels of land that are state-owned for the north-south corridor. The commerce funding to close Camp Hope came after it was already several hundred people. In fact, nobody knew how many hundred people. So one of the first things that happened is we contracted with the Empire Health Foundation, who brought in nonprofit providers to both count, badge, etc. Over 400 people got IDs and birth certificates from the Department of Licensing and the Department of Health. Commerce funding went to build new housing solutions. Over 300 were part of the Camp Hope solution. 100 of those committed to be affordable housing for at least 30 years. Others are shelter beds or detox beds. We also were able to provide employment services for some people, and some people actually went from Camp Hope to employment, working for the Department of Transportation as flaggers. So there are success stories out there. The problem is more people are becoming homeless due to our tight housing market. So it's not just a discrete population. We need a system approach that tries to prevent homelessness as well.
Ms. Stevens.
We need to create shelters. That's really the main thing. Unsheltered people die three times more. I wrote it weird. I'm sorry. And our winters are harsh. Our summers are harsh. The progressive views on things, taking people's liberties over people's responsibility, it's really kind of got us in this mess. It doesn't make sense to me because people are dying. Why wouldn't you want to be a little more aggressive and in sending them to the place they need to go for help? You're just letting them die on our streets in our winters, and that doesn't make sense. How can you say that you're caring so much about these people and just allowing them to rot, really? I don't understand it, and that's not what I'd like to see. I want to see shelters.
Mayor Woodward.
Well, let me be clear here. Camp Hope was started by an activist, a homeless activist who wanted to make a point, and she knew that if she left outside City Hall and located herself in the encampment at a Washington state property, even though it was in the city limits, we had no jurisdiction over state land. This was orchestrated. It didn't organically populate to 600 people. Julie Garcia promised and sent the word out across the state of Washington that if you come to Spokane, you get a tiny home. When I toured that camp multiple times, but last summer, one of her staff members said, yeah, this got out of hand. This got out of control. And I'm glad she's saying she would never create. She said she created, as you just quoted, that encampment. And you know what happened? Commerce lined her pockets with $1.5 million to manage that camp after she created it. Now, what kind of a program is that? Lining that she was rewarded for that encampment. That's what you get with Lisa Brown as mayor. And you're going to get a small Camp Hope in your neighborhood. She also supports parking lots where people can live in cars in your neighborhood. If you didn't like Camp Hope, I bet she didn't go visit any of the businesses that were traumatized or the neighbors that were victimized. Nobody from the state did. We couldn't close it, Tim Archer, because there was a federal lawsuit against us. So that's why we couldn't close it. But believe me, I wanted to close it a lot earlier than finally closed. Lisa didn't want to close it till the end of this year. It finally closed in June.
Mrs. Brown, 45-second rebuttal.
Yeah, that's completely false. And I hope you go on our website and look at a dashboard on Camp Hope, because the funding did not go to line anybody's pockets. And Empire Health Foundation has an audited financial statement on where the funding went. So you can see compassionate addiction treatment. You can see what went to Jules and where that money was spent. But most of the commerce money went to housing solutions and building them and creating new capacity for our system. And I have a letter signed by the mayor and Council President Beggs, July 20th, 2022, where they gave me the top priorities for funding for closing Camp Hope. And at the top of their list is purchase and rehab a motel on Sunset Highway, which as soon as it happened, the mayor then said, oh no, that wasn't us, that was Commerce's fault.
That is the time allotted. Mr. Archer did ask for rebuttal first.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to rebut all three. I want to talk about the 2,600 homeless in Spokane. That number is very high. It gets higher all the time. We added 50% more beds, and now there's 30% more homeless. The linear math you're told about, that we got this much, we'll build this much, and then we'll be good to go. Somehow it doesn't work. We spent $10 million 5 years ago. We spend $30 million now. If Disney World builds a new ride, more people come. We need to stop this madness. We have a government problem, not a homeless problem. It's not a linear math problem.
Mayor Woodward, 45-second rebuttal.
Well, anybody want to pose a guess of how many people were permanently housed after $24 million of commerce money for Camp Hope? 9.
False.
9. I just talked to Daniel at Housing Navigators. 9 were permanently housed. We housed more people at Camp Hope, about 120 to 150 who are still there. And the Catalyst Project has about 90 transitional housing, but half of the people end up leaving because they don't want to follow the rules. Most of the money, the $24 million, most of it went to nonprofits. It didn't get used to house people. It went to Catholic Charities. It went to service providers. It went to Empire Health, which you served on their board, so that was a nice little kinship there. And again, it went to line the pocket of an advocate who created that encampment. That's where the money went. And that's the kind of budgeting you get with Lisa Brown as mayor.
City of Spokane is embarking on a new initiative, a regional approach to the homeless crisis. It will include essentially all cities within Spokane County. This is at least the vision. In the county itself, stated goals to use this approach to reduce homelessness by 40% in 2 years. On June 28th, the result of a 90-day study were discussed with local mayors, commissioners, city and county leaders. At that meeting, a woman interrupted the proceedings, shouted, "Why are all these rich people sitting here while we're homeless?" They say there is a disconnect between what leaders believe they're doing and what the people believe is being done. How will you bridge that gap and get people to come on board and have a community conversation? Mayor Woodward, you are first.
Well, I'll just say I'm really excited about the Regional Homeless Authority model. We did take a trip. We took about 12 stakeholders, electeds, and businesses to Houston last fall to see how they were able to move the needle on homelessness, the 4th or 5th biggest city in the country that's been able to do that. They don't allow encampments. They do have navigation centers, and they were able to produce a record amount of housing to get those people into housing that were ready for housing. I think we can make it work. We have an aggressive goal that if we can get the interlocal agreements with the other cities involved to create and form this regional authority, then I think we're going to be very successful. Those who are creating this are saying that we can reduce homelessness in the next 2 years by 40%. And homelessness isn't just a City of Spokane issue, but we are addressing this issue for the entire region. I've been saying for years this is something we need to do. We can better coordinate our resources and our funding for better outcomes, bring more accountability into those outcomes, and decide who we're going to fund in the future based on those outcomes. So I've been a big proponent of it.
Ms. Stevens.
During the recession, I couldn't find a job anywhere. I had been in an apprenticeship for HVAC, and houses weren't being built anymore. I lost my job, and there was nothing. In 2011, I actually became homeless. I had a friend who let me live with him, and fortunately, I didn't have any mental health issues or addiction, but I was homeless. I've been there. That's how I can bridge the gap with these people. I'm not afraid of the issues that you have, whether it's drug addiction or mental illness. I will talk to you. I will tell you my success story. I'm standing here today. I was them. I understand. I understand how scary it is to be waiting to lose your home. It's an awful feeling. And the amount of stuff that some of these people have to leave behind is heartbreaking. I've had to clean up rentals with family pictures, and it's sad. I've been there.
Mr. Archer.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Kelly, for sharing that. And I work in the streets as an EMT. I've been there at their worst times too. At the end of successful suicides, during overdoses, holding on to their arteries after they've tried to commit suicide. Now, these are hard problems, and that is not all of those folks out there. What's sadly happening is we talk about this 2,600, is you have folks out there that are so mentally ill, so addicted they can't help themselves. And then without a lack of governance and making it a free-for-all, you attract a predatory element that I saw daily. Around some of these shelters, the drug dealer shows up with the drugs, they overdose in the back. We bring them back with your tax dollars, and the drug dealer just sits there looking at us. We need to change the climate and the environment here. It's not just not safe for us, it's not safe for the homeless. Now, in response to the Regional Homeless Authority and how wonderful Houston is, Houston doesn't allow encampments. That's the biggest mitigation they do. Gavin Cooley, a former chief financial officer of the city, is really excited about pushing this Regional Homeless Authority because it's a better way to spend your $30 million. The 2,600 number is a false representation of the scope of the problem.
That is time. Ms. Brown.
A regional approach is a good idea. 4 years ago at the KHQ debate, the mayor talked about a regional approach, but 4 years later, we still don't have it. So I support it. I think a coordination between especially the city and the county would be a good idea. But I want to point out that those nonprofits that got the funding are doing what the city has failed to do. The Spokane Homeless Coalition, which I gave tickets to come tonight with the candidates' tickets, is nonprofits and volunteers who are actually one by one helping people who are in situations of almost becoming homeless or on the pathway out of homelessness. And what's missing is city leadership. The city hasn't updated its dashboard. The city hasn't truly convened people and brought them together and created a plan. 4 years, no plan. Now there's a great idea that there will be one, or another great goal achieved in 2 years. What makes you think that doing the same thing we have done for the last 4 years is going to get us these dramatically better results 2 years from now? We need a change in course, and we certainly need a change in leadership to bring about that coordination and to actually harness the opportunities that these volunteers and churches and people who are making food for the homeless are actually providing. The compassion they are providing needs to be coordinated and harnessed with public resources to actually have an effective response to homelessness.
Mayor Woodward, I'll give you a 45-second rebuttal.
The city doesn't operate as service providers. We don't offer those services. We rely on the nonprofits that do that work. That's not the government's job. One thing that I would say is that we have been working regionally During COVID, when I said we kept the unsheltered housed, we worked for a year and a half with the county and the valley to make sure that people that would have left the Cannon Street shelter, which was only operating at that time half a year, we made sure that we had a place for them, and during a global pandemic. So we put them in the library when it was shut down and waiting to be renovated. Then we moved them into the arena because everything was shut down. There were no events. Then we moved into a building on Mission, which is now the Way Out Center. And we have worked regionally, unlike we've done ever before. And it was that framework that was set by, and that came about because of the pandemic, that now we are moving forward for this regional homeless authority. So you weren't in those conversations, but I was for a year and a half, and we had a great regional model for addressing homelessness during the pandemic. And we're going to move that forward in a much bigger way for the entire region.
I do want to move. We did ask some of our Nonstop Local KHQ viewers to submit their questions. This was one that came in. What successful homeless programs in other cities or communities have you investigated thoroughly to help understand and manage our current homeless situation in Eastern Washington? Mayor Woodward, you get first response.
Well, that's Houston. So we went last October. And like Tim Archer says, the things that make that regional model and their program successful are a number of things. They do not allow encampments. They have navigation centers, which is how we're operating track with wraparound services. We name people by and their need. We have a plan. We are operating that facility much like the facilities in Houston. Maybe we need another one. Maybe we don't need one that's 300 people. I understand the congregation part of it. It's a lot of people. But we are doing extremely good work. And now that we have sustainable funding streams for low-income housing, we are able to start working on a plan that can start building the housing that we need, that once they're ready, they can move into. That's the other part of it. We don't have housing. We don't have enough housing. And I'm going to say we need housing of all income levels, but we really do need more of the affordable housing, and we've never had funding for that. This state has been behind building housing. The city of Spokane for decades. We're 25,000 units behind in just the city of Spokane. So we have a lot of catching up to do, but we do have a plan. My administration is working right now on how to leverage those 1590 funds, which we get about $7 million a year, bond against that for a bigger impact to create more housing in a very expeditious way. So unlike Lisa, we do have a plan. We're working on it right now, and we're delivering results.
Ms. Stevens.
Obviously Houston, but a program I was looking into in New York was they provided enough shelters, and then they required people to go to those shelters. You were not allowed to sleep on the street. You had to go to a shelter. Now, the part I'm not sure about, and I'd like to know more about, is did they criminalize people that refused? I'm not sure. I'd love to have the answer for you, but that idea is something that I really believe in. If we make it a little less comfortable to sleep on the street, perhaps people will stop coming here. More shelters and requirements to be in them.
Mrs. Brown.
So what made the Navigation Center model successful in Houston and San Diego and other places is not the prohibition on camping. It was the provision of housing. They created a lot of housing units, and they used a data system, which we are failing in, to track both the people and the providers and the services that the providers provided. Programs that I have explored are the street medicine programs, Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, a tiny home plus recovery for sober, people who are sober and in recovery in Bellingham, and extensively studied navigation centers, which we don't have. So we could call it that, but that's not really what the Trent Shelter is. So we can make a big difference here if we actually take some of the best practices from other places, and in particular, we have to create more housing options, which is what over half of the funding that Commerce provided through the Right-of-Way Initiative went to housing. Housing that will be temporary emergency housing until 2023, and then there is a commitment to convert it into apartments for affordable housing for families for 30 years. We need more housing if we're going to adequately address the homelessness issue that we have in Spokane.
Mr. Archer.
Thank you. So just real quick, the regional approach that everyone thinks is going to solve this problem. City spent $26 million. The county spent $4 million. We'll combine all that and we'll make this regional approach. We've done this to ourselves because of weak governance. If you lived in the city of Spokane Valley, would you want to partner with the city of Spokane? Would you want to join in with them so that the city of Spokane, so that in the valley, your streets can look like some of our streets? I don't think that's going to happen. I think it'd be a disservice to them, and we need to clean up our own mess. Where did I go? I didn't have to go far. You can look at Coeur d'Alene, you can look at Boise, you can look at places like that. But where can you go to find out how to solve this? I can get there on a bicycle. It's 4 miles that way. The Union Gospel Mission. Now, I go back to that. That's fine if you want to support that and look at that, but why are we traveling when you have a decades-old model that works? Best practices. You don't have to go to others. They're right here. A lot of them are, as Kelly Stevens alluded to, volunteer-based. How about if we stop emptying your pockets to the tune of, let's give an example, the Trent Shelter, $50,000 a person to take care of them. That's more than a lot of folks in this room make. It's unconscionable. This isn't a homeless problem. This is a government problem.
What do you think are the top 3 underlying reasons Spokane has a large unhoused population? What would you do differently to try and address these issues? We begin with Mrs. Brown.
3 reasons. Okay, the tight housing market and the dramatic rises in rents and drop in vacancy rates. We have our own researchers at Gonzaga and EWU that have done the research that correlates dramatic rises in homelessness with that tightening housing market. Second, lack of planning by the city and local governments is part of the problem. Third, this administration left millions on the table that could have gone to affordable housing. Not only that, but the conversation about 1590 money, that was passed a couple of years ago, and none of it is out there building housing. Federal home dollars that were awarded in 2021 are just being put out today. There's been mismanagement and turnover in the housing department in the city, and unfortunately, that means we are behind in building affordable housing units that we could have been building with state and federal dollars and having those ready for homeless people.
Mayor Woodward.
Well, the rapid rehousing dollars that Lisa's talking about, we actively looked for properties. We couldn't find any that met the criteria. Catholic Charities put out a submission. It didn't meet the criteria. Volunteers of America wanted to access some of those funds. It didn't end up penciling out. Marcus Riccelli, a state representative, was part of those conversations. We didn't just leave money on the table. We didn't have vacant apartment buildings and vacant motels that we could quickly buy and rehab and move people in. In Seattle, they did. But we didn't. So no money was intentionally left on the table. That is an absolute lie coming out of Lisa every time she talks about that. When it comes to what the 3 reasons why people are unhoused, I will say it's not just a economic issue. It's less of an economic issue anymore. It's an addiction issue. As I said before, we are the #1 state. We are leading the nation in overdose deaths. We decriminalized drugs for 2 years in this state, and we have addiction on the street that we see every single day. They cannot be housed. They need to be helped first. And then, of course, mental health issues that are not being addressed. Cities are not funded and equipped to do that, but we have to come together and do a better job, and we need to do all of these things regionally.
Ms. Brown, I'll give you 45 seconds.
Yes. There's more than the rapid capital acquisition dollars, although it's hard to believe that we couldn't come up with any applications over a period of a couple of years. There are also behavioral health facilities dollars. There's the regular rounds of housing trust dollars. The mayor's own former housing director, one of them, John Hall, explained how we were misusing and leaving federal dollars on the table. And providers can tell you that it's an uncoordinated approach and delays in getting those federal dollars out the door, federal home ARP dollars that the city's been awarded that still aren't out there. No contracts have been negotiated to actually start building those housing units.
Mr. Archer.
3 reasons. Lack of law enforcement And I understand we have a problem with legislation. It needs to be fought. The incumbent told the newspaper that Boise versus Martin should be fought, just doesn't know if the city should take a lead in it. Those battles are ugly, they're expensive, but we need to fight them. I'd rather spend $3.8 million doing that instead of $3.8 million doing a cruel enabling and treating the homeless like a commodity with more of these high-dollar programs. So number one, lack of law enforcement. Number two, addiction. And number three, mental health. Like Kelly alluded to, you make it uncomfortable. We'll get rid of the criminal element. Those folks that are truly worthy and needy of our resources, it's not 2,600 people. I truly believe that. And I say that because I spent 20 years talking to them on the streets, waiting for the ambulance, yucking it up with them. I knew some of them better than I knew some of my neighbors. So it's patronizing to say that they're all just these delicate, broken flowers that they need millions of dollars of your tax dollars to fix. There's more to it than that. Law enforcement, reduce the number. The addiction and the mental health will then be a feasible number that we can mitigate. Thank you.
Ms. Stevens.
I believe the number was 20% blamed homelessness on no family or friend network. But that ties into the mental health, or specifically the drug addiction, because if you're burning bridges left and right, you're not going to get any help. I was fortunate because I'm not a bridge burner. I'm pretty nice. And I did have someone who was willing to take me in. So I'm not, that 20%, I have a hard time believing. Mental health and drug addiction, those two, they're so obvious. I had someone really close to me who had to go elsewhere to get proper addiction services. I believe he went to Yakima. I can't recall the name of the place, but because Yakima had the services that he needed, we didn't have it. Obviously, we have a housing crisis. There are people who, like me, just couldn't make it. We were trying so hard and we couldn't make it. I'd really love to take a look at our zoning requirements. I'm not sure why we have a max 35 feet height. That shouldn't apply to some areas. So something I'd like to take a look at. We can build more.
Our final question of the evening, and then we will provide 1 minute for each of the candidates to provide a closing statement. Thanks to all of you for joining us out there. The final question, with really the center of the homeless population being in the downtown metro core. Over and over in the news business, we have heard from business owners, many of them very small business owners with a very fine financial bottom line. Their windows are blown out, somebody's stealing from them. Really the tipping point whether they can actually stay in business. What do you plan to do going forward that will help buffer that hasn't happened so far? Mr. Archer, we'll start with you.
Boy, do I feel redundant. I feel like having you all say it for me. Law enforcement, I go to a downtown church. The front door window's been broke out, I believe, 3 times in the last year and a half. And it's not a wealthy church, and it's a big deal every time it happens. I was there for one of them and helped get the guy. And he was an out-of-towner just in Spokane a few months and walking the streets with an axe handle. Took a swing at our door while intimidating everyone else. Had a nice big knife in his back pocket he was hoping to use on me, but I made sure that didn't happen. So law enforcement is the key here. We need to bring order back to our streets. Otherwise, we're just working around the problem. We don't even know the scope or the scale of it. Thank you, Sean.
Mrs. Brown.
So there are a lot of visibly homeless people that are downtown, but it's important to understand there are a lot of homeless people, visible or not, all over our city. They're in all the neighborhoods. They are living by the river. They are parked in cars or RVs by our parks. As I'm knocking on doors, people tell me about this. And so we have to acknowledge the significance of the number of people who are visibly homeless or almost homeless, living doubled up with friends and family until that relationship breaks, and then they will be homeless. So we've got to work on those prevention issues, and we've got to build more housing units, as well as have the navigation center model that I talked about before that will create accountability both for the system and for the individuals. It's really important that we support our downtown businesses, but I will tell you that I have talked with them, and they understand that law enforcement alone is not an answer. Law enforcement plus street medicine is a good approach to actually de-escalating people having a crisis on the street and freeing up law enforcement. If law enforcement's only responding to 42% of calls, and we've got to do something more than a law enforcement approach. And we have businesses in the Garland neighborhood and in the Perry neighborhood and in all parts of our city who also want solutions to these problems. So it's not downtown versus neighborhoods, it's downtown plus neighborhoods need public safety, and they need an effective homelessness navigation center model so that they can know that their tax dollars are being well spent.
Ms. Stevens.
Sounds like we can probably just put Tim out there and he'd take care of some of that.
I'd take Kelly with me.
Yeah.
I need backup.
We got it. So downtown, we're seeing different types of groups. And I want to say we're talking about policing the dangerous ones, right? There's a lot of people that are just out there because they have nowhere to go. But there are people who are busting windows. We are strangling our downtown by allowing this to happen. The idea was you can't be on private property. You can be on public property. 7-Eleven is not public property. Starbucks, which is gone now, not public property. And these people have caused these businesses to quit because it's dangerous, it's unhealthy, and it's scary to go down there. You're always being asked for money, and I'm usually really sweaty from work, and I feel like I just earned all this money. So that can be frustrating. But we do need to really be policing the more dangerous people down there for sure.
Mayor Woodward.
Well, downtown is special. It's the economic engine of our region. My family owns a business downtown, so we see the impact on a daily basis. Our officers are doing as best of a job as they can. When Lisa talks about a 42% response rate, that's for 911. That's a county service. That doesn't involve all of our police officers. Our police officers are responding to 250 calls every single day, nearly 100,000 a year. That's why I moved the precinct back into the downtown core so that we could have more officers downtown getting to know the businesses and being able to do some proactive work. We have staffed, we've reconfigured the model so that we have double the patrols downtown. I talk to those businesses each and every single day. I meet with them all. I list all the complaints. Believe me, come to my office, and we're doing everything that we can. But we have to preserve downtown. Best practices back in the day was to have all the resources in one area and a lot of the shelters in one area so that those who are accessing those services could actually get to them. That is not best practice now. It needs to be a dispersed model that has had the impact that it's had, a very negative impact on our downtown, our businesses with the Havens and the Catholic Charities and all the other services. We need to disperse those. But downtown is special. When we revised the ordinance for camping, Lisa did not support that. We had 70 businesses behind us, and she criticized that new, stronger camping ordinance so that we could move people to shelters and out of our downtown. And so she doesn't support ordinances or policies that really make a difference to our downtown. Her programs or policies would enable and make homelessness even more comfortable than it already is.
Mrs. Brown, I'll give you 45 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. What my approach with the camping ordinance is it's not enough to say where people can't be. You have to say where they can be. The mayor has never in 4 years had enough capacity for the visible counted homeless. And there are more people than the visible counted homeless. And so attacking me for pointing out the obvious that it's not enough to move people. Where will they move to? Whose neighborhood will they go to? That's not a solution. Shelters can be part of a solution, especially because it offers the opportunity to offer people services they need and to create a plan. Housing has to be at the end of that plan, and some people will have services and housing. There are success stories out there, but this city is not one of them.
In a matter of equal time, Mayor Woodward, 45 seconds.
Yeah, we will never have enough low-barrier shelters to house every single homeless person that we count on the street. That's just not going to happen. You talk about the track being expensive. We do not have the money in order to do that. We have to do a better job. I agree, and we are doing a great job. We have gotten results. We're fighting crime downtown, and we have shelter capacity to move people too. Lisa's idea of telling them where they can go, it'll be in your neighborhood, a tiny Camp Hope. It'll be in your neighborhood, a parking lot that's full of cars with people living in those cars. That will be her solution of where they can go.
Time for closing statements. Each candidate gets 1 minute to close. We will start with Mr. Archer and go down the line.
Thank you, Sean. I think I've been quite clear about what I want to do. All I need is you all to put me in the position to do it. This is truly more simple than we're making it. When he asked for the 3 reasons, and we all said basically law enforcement, addiction, and mental health, that's true. Those are 3 things that have been addressed for decades. Phil Altmaier, will you please raise your hand? Thank you for coming. You want to know how to do it right? Go ask that guy. He's been doing it for decades. Thank you, Sean.
Mayor Woodward's approach to homelessness has failed. We have more homeless people, millions of dollars mismanaged or left on the table, conflict, lawsuits instead of planning and partnerships. If it isn't obvious now, it will be if and when the mayor shows us her budget for next year and when the snow starts to fall again. There is a better way. As your next mayor, I will bring people together, and we will prove that public, private, and nonprofit resources can be coordinated. People can be helped and held accountable. We will get our fair share of state resources instead of leaving the money on the table, and we will spend taxpayer dollars on things that work instead of pouring millions into a warehouse that doesn't have basic facilities leased by one of her major donors. You can see my public safety plan and my plan for addressing homelessness compassionately and effectively at lisabrownformayor.com. I appreciate your vote and support. Don't believe the negative ads.
I thought you were going to say my name.
I can. Ms. Stevens.
Thank you. Okay.
Me and Kelly can't afford negative ads. So.
No.
You need her.
So I really want to just make sure that I'm working to bring back accountability. With your children, you tell them, you can't do this thing because I love you. And that's kind of where I'm at. These guys on the streets, they can't do some of this stuff because I care. They can't be sleeping unsheltered because they have a higher chance of dying. We just can't let that happen. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm all for throwing as much money at shelters as possible to get those going so we can get people in them.
Thank you, Sean. Lisa may call them negative ads. It's her record. And I'm sorry that you don't like it, but that's your record of raising taxes and talk about budget issues. Back during the recession when you had a difficult time at the Senate, balancing the budget, you wanted to raid the police and fire pension funds of $75 million. That's something I would never do. I will not raise taxes to balance our budget. I am required by law to present a balanced budget by the end of this year, and we will. What we've heard tonight is a clear contrast of very different visions for our city. I've lived here 33 years, and I think this is the most important election of the time that I've been here now. I am fighting to bring Spokane into the future, not backwards. I'm proud of my accomplishments on homelessness, crime, housing, economic development, and I've had to do all of that and fight reckless policy at the state and the city council level. If you believe like I do that government exists to govern for the people, not over the people, then I am asking once again and for a final time for your support for mayor of our great city.
On behalf of Nonstop Local KHQ, I'd like to say thank you to all 4 candidates for agreeing to be here and have a discussion on what is truly one of the critical and vexing issues of our time. And I also want to recognize the crowd here at the downtown library who respected the rules and stayed quiet so we can have a conversation. It got more questions in, but you can applaud now if you would like to. The primary is on August 1st. Hopefully this live forum allowed you to cast an informed vote. Thanks so much for joining us on Nonstop Local KHQ. I'm Sean Owsley. Have a great night.